Well, thank you very much for that nice welcome, and I'm happy to be here. And I think what she said about art is so true. It is the artists and the writers, the poets, the dreamers that preserve our history. And Maynard Dixon was one of those. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about him and then how we ended up in Mount Carmel. We lived in California for 34 years. We were born and raised in northern Utah, but my husband took a job in Silicon Valley in 1967, and so we loaded up everything that we owned. We were just newly married, 2 years with a baby, and we sought our fortune in California. Little did we know we would end up in the art business. We had no idea at that time. But when he started making a little bit of money, we decided we wanted to start collecting art. And we had a friend in Salt Lake who was a large collector of Maynard Dixon's work, and he introduced us to it. So we began seeking them out and buying them, and then eventually selling them. And when my husband figured out he could make more money as an art dealer than he could working for someone else in about 1979, 1980, he decided to cut the corporate ties and become a full-time art dealer. So let me tell you about Maynard Dixon. This is his Thunderbird. The Thunderbird, of course, you all know the legend of the Thunderbird that the Native Americans all revere. And this was Maynard Dixon's interpretation of it that he designed very early as a young boy. So there he is, that's a bust of him, and that sits on a table in the Dixon studio in Mount Carmel. This is the home that we restored. This was his last living place, and this is what brought us to Mount Carmel. So who was Maynard Dixon? He was an interesting character. He was a sensitive child. He was sickly as a child. He was asthmatic. He was indoors a lot. He grew up on a farm and a ranch in Fresno, California. His father had been a Confederate soldier and had fought in the Virginia Regiment. The family had come from the South, where they had a cotton farm, and after the ravages of the Civil War, his father sent the two sons, Harry St. John Dixon and his brother, to find a new life, and so they came to the California coast, and they settled in what was called at that time the Alabama Settlement, and it later turned out to be the city of Fresno. Maynard's father went to San Francisco, and there he met Constance Maynard. Constance Maynard was the daughter of a naval officer from San Francisco. Both of his parents, of Maynard Dixon's parents, came from independent stock, and it was something that carried over in the young boy Maynard Dixon. He was born in 1875. His mother was instrumental in encouraging his great artistic abilities that she could see at a very young age, and so she'd give him paper and crayons and scissors and paste and whatever, and pencils. And by the time he was 8 years old, he started to draw. They lived on a ranch that they had named Refuge, and it was there that he grew up, and he learned how to paint and to draw and observe everything that was going on around him. So that by the time he was 16 years old, he was so proficient at drawing that he thought, I really think I want to be an artist. I think that's the life I want to pursue. So he sent a bunch of his drawings to a man he admired greatly as an illustrator, and that was Frederick Remington. Frederick Remington wrote back to him and he said, young man, you draw much better than I ever did at your age. So if you will continue to observe and draw everything you see, you can become a great artist someday. He took that to heart, and he started very, very young to get commissions. Kevin Starr was a wonderful writer from California. Maybe some of you are familiar with him, historian. In 1977, the California Historical Society published a book of Maynard Dixon's poems. He'd also been a poet from a young age. And so Kevin Starr knew Maynard Dixon, and he interviewed him, and he learned a lot about him. He said, Maynard Dixon had a very simple, very direct ideas about art. He believed that art was a healthy, natural event, not the hothouse activity of a cult. The best art, Dixon believed, did not come from aesthetic dogma, but from life vigorously lived and pursued by the artist. Dixon despised the worship of the obscure or the eccentric, the belief, in his words, that if it's goofy, it must be art. He also believed that art, especially American art, could seek to please an American audience, or at least the sensitive segments of that audience, and not defy it with obscurantism or self-contemplating artiness. Art for Maynard Dixon began in the interaction of nature, experience, and the artist. It sought directness and clarity, and as a working painter, he despised a lot of talky talk about art, especially when such pseudo-conceptual prattle dictated practice. There is more nonsense written and spoken about art, which no one yet has been able to define, he believed, than any other of our interests except perhaps finance. The proof of all visual art lies in what it can add to the experience of its beholders, not in any critique, analysis, or explanation. He goes on and he talks more and more about Dixon and his beliefs. He was primarily a representational artist, and he believed in being honest, and he believed in natural art, of painting what was naturally out there. So many of the romantic artists that preceded him glorified, romanticized the landscape, particularly the Western landscape. Did I just turn this off? You can still hear me? Okay. And so Dixon believed that you should not be copying anyone, that you should stay true to yourself. Well, he tells this little story about Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was, of course, you might know, a revered muralist from Mexico. And all of the artists at that time in San Francisco were just enthralled with Diego Rivera. Well, Diego Rivera, unfortunately, he passed over Maynard Dixon for a mural. And Maynard Dixon was not happy about it. But he did admire his work. But he said, his idea was that you should not be copying Diego Rivera. You should be doing your own thing. So what did they all do? And Diego Rivera had basically said the same thing. So then he goes on to say, so what did they do? They all went out and copied Diego Rivera. So these are just some illustrations from that book of poetry. And if you ever get a chance to read it, it's called Rimrock and Sage. And Maynard did all of these are drawings that are used in that book. This is a very early illustration from Overland Monthly, 1893, same year. This is a very early drawing, 1894, 1893. You can see at that point, he was just not, well, he was 20 years old at that point. There's an early watercolor that we had at one time, one of the earliest that anybody's ever found. And this is from a ranch in Oregon in '01. Pony strutting. So those are just some sketches. He was constantly doodling and sketching, but he didn't just really decide that he was an artist until 1915. That was when he had learned to paint. He had had experience. He'd had a lot of experience in illustration, and he was ready to be a fine artist. He was married briefly to a woman by the name of Lillian Toby. They were divorced, and they had been living in New York. They came back. Maynard said, "I want to go back to the West that I know and love." So they came back to San Francisco, and it was there that he took a studio in San Francisco. And below him, the floor below him, was a photographer by the name of Dorothea Lange. You might have heard of Dorothea Lange, very famous photographer of the Depression era. And so they got together, they got married, they had 2 sons, and they had quite a wonderful life for a long time, because during the 20s, they were married in 1921, there was the heyday of San Francisco. The economy was booming, and he was getting all kinds of mural commissions and other commissions, and having shows, museum shows, gallery shows, and doing well. Both of them were doing well. That gave him the opportunity also to start traveling through the Big West, the big wide West that he really loved. He felt like that was where he found his soul and where he found his true expression in his art. So this is him out painting in the West. You can imagine that time, he rode on horseback, he went all kinds of remote places. Those were the great times in San Francisco. This is a mural in the California State Library. This is the Room of the Dons in the Mark Hopkins Hotel. These are the early sketches for it. We had those at one time. Fortunately, we sold them. This is an early painting called What an Indian Thinks. Now, when Maynard Dixon painted the Indian, he did it with a reverence for them. At that time, they were living in sort of poverty conditions, but he never painted them that way. He admired them. He admired their spirit. He admired their religion, their beliefs, their crafts, the beauty that they created, and he painted them that way. He painted them as noble people. This is just another one of a dancer that we once had. A little early, very early oil. This is 1915. Now, it's interesting as we go through these, you'll see how his style changes. He really started painting more like an impressionist painter with a lot of paint, with a focus on light and color. And as his abilities advanced, he began to be much more graphic. These are some of Lange's photographs. There he is with his 2 little sons, Daniel, born in 1925, and John, born in 1928, both of which we've gotten to know well. They both passed away now, but what a treasure trove of information they were to us. This is San Joaquin Plains, 1921. Sand Hill Camp, which is down where he lived. Clouds and Prairie. So here we are. Now we are into where he's making a transition into his more modernist style. If you were to ask any art historian about American art, and the name Maynard Dixon was mentioned, some of them might say, how many of you know who Edward Hopper was? Well, they often refer to Maynard Dixon as the Edward Hopper of the West. He loved to paint the lonely places, the high clouds in the sky, the other world that was out there, the low mesas, the colors, the horseback riders, the Native Americans. And he found beauty in simplicity. So here again, this is becoming a much more modern approach to his work. He abstracted, he designed, he composed. Instead of making literal paintings, they were designed and imaginative. This one is called The Grim Wall. This is in a collection of Dorothea Lange, or not Dorothea Lange, excuse me, Diane Keaton. We sold this back in about we sold it a couple times. That's another story for another day. This is called Coronado's Rock, 1923. And here you can see that modernism coming into his work. 1923, The Golden Range, The Wise Men, Migration, 1924. We just had that one just a couple of years ago. So now we basically broker paintings because we can't afford them to buy them. But this one is probably one of his most well-known paintings. It's called Cloud World. It was painted in 1925, and it's probably one of the best examples of his modern style. He created this. There's really not a lot of literal in there. He designed those clouds. But when you come to this area and you travel through and you're happen to see a beautiful cloudy day, you can often see these flat-bottomed clouds. And he took them and he designed them and he made a painting, a poetic painting, that with a title that says, "Look at this, there's a world above us, there's a world beyond us, there's infinity, and who are we but just small people on this planet?" This was an interesting story of a 3-paneled screen that a woman brought to us when we lived in California. And she called my husband and she said, I was a model for Maynard Dixon when he lived here. And when he left the area, he didn't want to take this because it was too cumbersome. It's a 3-paneled, basically plywood screen with canvas on it. And she said it was a dressing screen, so I would dress behind it or undress behind it, and he would paint me. And she said, I don't know what to do with it anymore. I've been thinking about cutting it up into several paintings. My husband said, oh, please don't do that. I'll be right there. So he jumped in his station wagon, drove to San Francisco, loaded it up, and told her what he thought he could get for it, and we brought it back to our gallery. It had no title. Most of his work was titled and numbered. This one had a signature but no title, so we titled it Study in Cubist Realism. And it's stuck, and now we see it in museums all over the place, on traveling shows and so forth. This one's called Mountains and Sunset Light. Navajo Land. This was painted in 1927. So when you look at these paintings and they look as if they could be painted today, it's because he was really ahead of his time in the way that he was approaching the landscape. He was not painting it in a realistic way necessarily, but more taking the important elements and telling a story, a poetic story in most cases. And of course, when you look through these slides, you cannot get the full impact of the paintings. You have to see things in real life. I often say, paintings are like people. You cannot appreciate them until you meet them in real life. This is a wonderful painting we found while we were living in California, and it had been purchased out of a show in, I believe it was Cleveland, Ohio, and we were fortunate enough to get that. I wanted so bad to keep it, but we really couldn't afford it. It's a big painting. It's 40 by 50, and so we sold it to a collector that still has it in his collection, and it was recently just shown in a museum show in Scottsdale. This one is one of my favorites. You might think that's strange, but it's called Como se pasa la vida. In 1931, the height of, the Depression beginning and so forth, Maynard and his sons and Dorothea all went to Taos, New Mexico, and they were there for about 6 months. And during that time, he was able to paint a large body of work. This was a neighbor that lived next to where they were at that time. And it was just a simple adobe. But he took this simple adobe and made a wonderful painting out of it. And it has just that portico with that shadow coming through and that design, the way it goes across the middle of the painting there. And it was just a beautiful, simple statement. And the title, Como se pasa la vida, basically, loosely translated, as life passes. Allegory. He did a lot of these kind of symbolic paintings, things that talked about the Native Americans and their beliefs and some of the unknown about our futures, where we come from, where we go, those kind of stories that are poetic. This one is probably one of my first conversions to Maynard Dixon, you might say. We saw this at a show at the Oakland Museum. No, it was the DeYoung Museum. It's in the collection of the Oakland Museum. But we saw this, and I was just blown away. This is another really large painting, and you really need to see it in real life. But it's called Earth Knower. Now, to me, the magic and the magnificence of this painting is that by just that title, Earth Knower, you understand the painting. The Native American has the same tone of skin as the earth from which he comes. The folds of the blanket replicate the folds of the earth. The shadows, the colors, as he's telling a story. And of course, the Native American believes they do come from the earth, and that is where they return after life. And this just to see this in real life, it really nearly sends you to tears because it tells the story of the Native American. Maynard was fortunate to be an illustrator all of his life, and he made whatever he could do to make money, he did. And so he was constantly taking illustration jobs. He did a lot of covers for Sunset Magazine from the turn of the century forward up until the late 30s. This one is from 1934, and it's called In Zion. This is Mormon country. This is when he'd actually traveled through this area many times and painted before he ever decided to make a homestead here. And he and Dorothea and their boys had camped at Mount Carmel Junction at one point. And so he knew of that east side of Zion and how remote and lovely it was over there. And so he decided, when he actually subsequently got divorced from Dorothea and then remarried, they left San Francisco and they came to Mount Carmel and purchased the property there. Ditch Line and Mesa, 1933. Approach to Zion. This is quite a wonderful painting. As you're coming in to Zion from Hurricane, as you're coming up around before you get, way up into where Virgin is and those areas, you can see this very, very scene. So this is Dorothea Lange, and in 1935, with the pressures of the Depression and a lot of things that went on, both Maynard and Maynard and Dorothea were born out. She left him basically for another man, a professor at Berkeley. He was heartbroken. He was depressed. But he soon snapped out of it when he met this young woman. She was a muralist in San Francisco, and she had called him up to ask him for advice on a mural and how to scale it up. This is some working on a mural that she did for the Coit Tower in San Francisco. They met up, they got married in 1935, and in 1937, they decided they wanted to get out of San Francisco, and they wanted to live in the Southwest, where he'd always wanted to live. He was 27 years older than her, but that didn't seem to matter because they had a lot in common. She being an artist, he being an artist, and she revering him and the career that he had had. She admired him greatly. So they decided to leave San Francisco, and they came to Mount Carmel, and they purchased the property there. Originally, it was 20 acres. It is now 49 acres with the subsequent owner that added on to it. Here's Maynard in that bust you saw in the very first picture. This was done by an artist out of Orderville by the name of Albert Porter. And he sat Maynard down in front of the logs when they were building the house and sculpted that bust of him. And there's Diana's throne. Many of you are familiar with that when you come up Highway 89. Hemingway Wash, that's right out down by St. George, Las Vegas area. Moonlight over Zion. Now there's a wonderful painting. This is in the collection of BYU. In 1937, BYU purchased 85 paintings from Maynard, and most of them were his Depression era pieces, but they also have a lot of Utah landscapes, particularly southern Utah landscapes. But this is wonderful because if you've ever driven through Zion at night, it's quite a spooky place with the way that the moonlight can come on some of those rock formations. Home of the Blackfeet. He traveled all over. He went to, all over the West. And each painting was unique and different. Lazy Autumn. This is also in the BYU collection. And there you probably know that mountain. We know it well. We look right out our front window at it every day. It's called Sugar Knoll. And every artist since that ever comes to Mount Carmel paints it at least once. Mormon home. This Mormon home still exists there. And those people, if they are still alive, would be in their 90s because this was painted in 1940. At that time, of course, Mount Carmel was just a little tiny town, and the road narrowed down as it went through the town, and there were cottonwood trees all along the road. Now they've widened the road, and those cottonwood trees along the road are no longer there. Land of Tilted Mesas, 1944. At this point, he was really painting just really what he wanted to paint. He wasn't painting particularly for any market. He was painting just for his own pleasure. Here it is, Peace in October. This beautiful time of the year that we all enjoy in this area, when the cottonwood trees turn bright gold against the blue sky. That was something that he loved to paint every fall. Now, when my husband worked directly with Edith Dixon in San Francisco, because after she sold the property to Milford Zorns in 1963, she retired there, and she still was dealing in Maynard Dixon's work. And so Paul, my husband, would go and meet her, and she'd give him a bunch of art to sell, and he'd sell it, and then he'd go back to San Francisco and pay her and get some more, and that's the way it went for many years. So they became good friends. Little did he know at that time, however, that we would be buying his home in Utah. Even though they'd talked a little bit about it, they didn't really ever discuss it much. just that she had an interest in the Mormon people because they lived among them so long, and he was a Mormon boy, grew up in Utah, so they had a lot in common, a lot to discuss, and she liked him a lot. And so we were able to resolve her inventory in 1987 when she decided to get out of the business. But she told Paul that this was she and Maynard, and they were grazing under a tree at the end of their days, called Peace in October. This was just 3 years before he passed away. He had emphysema. He was not doing well. There's another one. Anytime you can get a cloud painting of Maynard Dixon, it's going to be a lot more money than almost any of his paintings. This one is an interesting painting. This was done as a statement about the Depression. It was called Shapes of Fear. It's in the Smithsonian Institution, and it is these are faceless figures, and it was about the vanishing traditions not only of the Native American, but of all Americans. Where are our traditions? Where is our country going? Where will we end up? The fear that was in everyone's minds at that time. Mountain juniper, just a beautiful juniper tree. He painted every tree like a portrait. No tree was a cookie cutter tree that he just stuck in a painting. They were all unique and different. There he is, out painting in Mount Carmel. There he is, sitting in the backyard. These aren't very good because they came from a movie that we found several years ago. These are just stills from that movie, and the resolution isn't very good, but you can see him rolling his own. He was a chain smoker, even though he'd been asthmatic and he had emphysema, but he still smoked. Back in the day when I think a lot of times they thought it was good for you, and especially he found the herb kinnikinnick. Have any of you ever heard of kinnikinnick? It's an Indian herb that grows on the desert, and they dry it and they crush it like tobacco and smoke it. And maybe he thought that was good for him. I don't know. But there he is, sitting in the backyard under a grape arbor in his chair, which we now have in Mount Carmel. If you come there, you'll see that chair. There he is cooking on an old camp stove. There he is walking up to the back door. Road to the river, that's right across the street from where his home is up there. And this little barn, they just tore it down just a couple years ago. I was sad when that happened. Summer sunlight. November, Mount Carmel. There's Sugar Mill again. Cottonwood Crossing. Home of the Desert Rat. This painting is a large painting. It's in the Phoenix Art Museum. The Desert Rat, of course, is referring to that little house and that man that lives there. There's Maynard and Edith, 1943. There he is, the front gate. This was taken by his good friend, Ansel Adams. They were good friends. They had similar ideas and philosophies about the vanishing West. They were sad to see what was happening. You might have even called them early conservationists. There's Edith by Ansel Adams. You can see that she was really beautiful and a very kind and lovely woman. So Maynard Dixon knew that his days were numbered. Now, at the same time that they had the house in Mount Carmel, they also had established a home in Tucson, Arizona. And it was there that was for the winter months. They would go there. They'd spend their summers in Mount Carmel and then go to Tucson for the winter. Maynard knew that his days were numbered, and he told Edith that when he passed away, he wanted to be cremated and he wanted his ashes spread at Mount Carmel. So she said, I took his ashes one day, and basically, the memorial spot for Maynard is completed now, with a trail leading up to the ridge where the white sandstone rocks containing the inscription plaque are located. We've planted some native plants and shrubs about the spot, and I had earlier placed the ashes beneath the rock one early morning by myself. It is a beautiful lookout over the country that he loved and painted, which association plus the pleasant memories of his friends will be better than any ceremony when they come through here and climb up to that spot by themselves. Maynard, when he passed away, she sent a little invitation out, and on the cover of that was his poem, At Last, which became his epitaph. And there it is, the plaque that is placed on the rock where his memorial is. The second owners were Milford and Pat Zorns. We purchased it from them in 1963. This was what it looked like when we bought it. There's a lot of work to do, and I don't know if I could ever do it again. I was much younger then. But it was quite a mess. Milford Zorns was 90 years old, and they hadn't been there for several years. He just couldn't take care of it anymore, and they were living in California, so I made a deal with my husband, and that's how we acquired it. So we just drove in and started doing all the work. Even our grandsons got involved. There I am. Paul became a carpenter. And it all started to come together. And this is what it looks like now. Luckily, we were able to save a lot of the things that belonged to the home. We formed a 501c3 foundation. It's been on the National Register of Historic Places. And we started inviting artists and coming there for workshops and shows. And over the 22 years since we've been there, we've had hundreds of artists. We've had many, many, many art shows. And in about 15 years ago, we built a gallery there on the property, which you can come and see when you come there. So, in closing, I'd just like to just make a quote Maynard's poem. At last, I shall give myself to the desert again, that I and its golden dust may be blown from a barren peak and broadcast over the sunlands. If you would desire some news of me, go ask the little horned toad, whose home is the dust, or seek it among the fragrant sage, or question the mountain juniper, and by their silence, they will truly inform you. Thank you.